I'm really happy to introduce Vyshali Manivannan. Vyshali goes back with the workshop for a long time. She entered here a while ago when we used to have this thing called the Page Turner Festival. So it's really nice to have her back here in this capacity. She's been dissertating for a long time. And she was just telling me about it, and it sounds fascinating. Her dissertation focuses on discourse on the ailing body, biomedical technologies intended to render chronic pain visible, and the ableist imperatives of academic style. That's awesome. She's a PhD candidate in journalism and media studies at Rutgers, and she also holds an MFA. She has published a science fiction novel, Invictus, and she's had creative work featured in The Consequence, Fanzine, Black Clock, among other literary journals. She was nominated for a 2015 Pushcart Prize in Nonfiction and was among those listed in the Notable Essays in Literary Nonfiction in 2014. She's also doing creative work outside of her dissertation right now and working on a nonfiction manuscript about Sri Lanka's civil war and its parallels with and lessons for the contemporary political landscape in the US. And she also has tattoos that she says she teaches with, so maybe she'll talk about that. Sorry. Okay. Thank you so much. Welcome, Vyshali.
Hello. Always louder up here. I do have tattoos I teach with. I also have a magnet in my finger, so we can talk about that too, since we're talking about robots and hybrid bodies and bodily transformations. So the format of this will go, I will introduce each reader, and each reader will come up and do the reading for a bit, and then I will come back up here, and we will do this until the Q&A at the end with moderation, and then open it up to the audience. So without further ado, our first reader is going to be Ching-In Chen, whose recombinant examines erasure, female and genderqueer lineages, and reconstruction of history. In Trish Salah's words, how might a poem diagram destruction? What survives records, or doesn't, leaves traces, ledgers, or ghosts marginalia? It is a bleak and beautiful summoning, one that discovers and inscribes a world anew in testifying to the destruction of this one. Born of Chinese immigrants, Chen is a Kundiman, Lambda, Callaloo, and Watering Hole Fellow, and a member of the Macondo and Voices of Our Nations Art Foundation's writing communities. A community organizer, they have worked in the Asian American communities of San Francisco, Oakland, Riverside, and Boston, as well as helped organize the 3rd National Asian Pacific American Spoken Word and Poetry Summit in Boston. Chen is also the co-editor of The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Violence Within Activist Communities, and Here is a Pen, an anthology of West Coast Kundiman poets. Please welcome Ching-In.
Thank you. Thank you, Asian American Writers Workshop, to my co-readers, for all of you for being here. How are you all doing tonight? Good? Okay, great. So, I'm going to start with a poem. I'm about to see my mother. I'm going to Massachusetts very shortly after this for the Massachusetts Poetry Festival, and I grew up in Massachusetts. So I'm going to read a poem about alternative mothers, and it's actually the origin, like a seed poem for the book, because a lot of the book thinks about what if we have this history, what if something else happens. Island where these things origin. 20 hours a day, your mother's before you, all robot, all hand. Your street market mother bear you desert. Your rich mother sell you father for rice bowl. Heady mother with wrong amphibian love. Deposit you in boarding school to avoid the shame life. This mountain grandmother coin operate in hallway. A captain mother sell whalebone to First Museum of Americas. A stay put mother fly wisp of smoke. A starlit mother bury backyard career. A stay at home velvet couch mother mix arsenic into cake and off herself. Warden's suggestion, a run to equator and like your father sweet who become mother too. So Much of the book deals with different strands of history and kind of the gaps of what we don't know. And the way that I think about speculative writing is what would happen in those spaces if we speculated. So I lived in Milwaukee for a time, and I've learned about these anti-Chinese Milwaukee riots, which happened against these Chinese men who worked in the laundries there. And this incident wasn't very well known and wasn't captured a lot. And I happened to come across a historical article about it. And so I'm going to read you these bits that I took from the article, and it's an article by a historian named Victor Ju. And then I'm going to read you the full piece, which has both speculation and historical bits. It's called Heritage. To say in front of all these people, men and boys surging, in knots of half a dozen or more, who have paid money for their wives, reckless. Get a rope, regular traffic, black with people, the little mite, a good many times, the unprintable, sneaking, advance afoot, string them up to a lamp post. Heritage. When to say a woman become monument in front of all these people, never sang poured songs or pull by my hair into line. She placed me row by row, men and boys, black heads surging, uncover production in knots of half a dozen or more. I became not her stone, who have paid money for their wives. She reckless stood tremble in fire. Get a rope, say the crowd face, regular traffic, black with people. Stare her down, the little mite, corridor, a good many times, the unprintable, sneaking, advance afoot, string them up to a lamp post. Okay, so I'm just going to read. Okay, just trying to look at the time. Okay, I'm going to just read you some excerpts from a longer kind of quasi-narrative. And it does involve a giant sculpture that the mother is making with in a kind of factory. So I'll read you some excerpts from this. And the larger piece is called One Testimony Am Lao. And I don't usually read this parts of this section aloud, but in honor of tonight's theme, robots, I thought it was appropriate. Testimony A. Conceive on metal and leather scrap. By time I born, phoenix sculpture, weigh a ton. This mother, a regular worker, sing belly airful, hulk above workers, boot from town to town, gather. Outside city, this father conduct, unlike anything whole. Enterprise, only visit worksite, Mondays, Wednesdays, and seen except on stage. Fridays, inspect operation progress. He initially think her shorn. Become 12-ton remnant, hair, smooth face, some boy he bring, 12 in line around world abroad long ago. Demolition and debris, steel and beam, gifts to remark on how lovely, like drinking tears, how remarkable migrant sweat, how kind. Isn't why they start, bring mother little food. When she stop, talk, her mouth, no one. Shed a flaking skin, I'm no one they've seen before. Testimony B. Conductor, watch, mother's hand socket wrench. I track orchestra as wood, root, and curve, wear down floor, plate molt and balcony steel. When minutes complete halve and flake circle, center work pile heart. Years later, shed eyes, travel country, risks they child's paid for lungs, risks frost tongue to eat, risks build this empire, containers oyster sauce, skin shelves Mobius on basement sand. Face up from sanitized hands, peel and pain, shake and shred. Ash, they sigh and repeat. Thank you. Thank you.
So next up, we have Mimi Mondal, whose Luminescent Threads, Connections to Octavia E. Butler, co-edited with Alexandra Pierce, collects first-person accounts of marginalized authors in the genre of science fiction and fantasy. Mundell is a Dalit speculative fiction writer and editor from India whose own stories engage with identity, intersectionality, re-examining histories, both personal and political, mythology as archetypes, and the varying rhetorics of love. She has been a Commonwealth Scholar at the University of Stirling in Scotland and an Octavia E. Butler Memorial Scholar at the Clarion West Writers' Workshop. Luminescent Threads is currently nominated for a Hugo Award and a Locus Award in 2018, making Mundell the first Hugo Award nominee from India. Please welcome Mimi.
Does it work? It does, right? Thank you so much for having me here. I'm reading from a story called His Footsteps Through Darkness and Light, which will come out from Tor.com in 2019. And Marco Palmieri there is my editor who edited it. This story is from a larger world, but it's also standalone, so you don't need to know the entire world. I'll read the first part. Then there's a performance that I'll skip, and I'll read the third part, which I think will be relevant to this event. So yeah. I am not a fighter. I'm a trapeze master. At the majestic Oriental Circus, which had been my home for 2 years, I had climbed the ropes fast till I was the leader of a team of about 15 aerial performers. It was in my genes. There were other rewards, too, of the circus life. It had brought me into the grace of Shehzad Marid. A trapeze master has no lack of duties, but I continued to perform with Shehzad in his great stage illusions show, Aladdin and his magic lamp. I took great pride in my own trapeze act, but I have to admit Aladdin was the crowd's favorite. None of that credit was due to me. I was a genius at the ropes overhead, flinging myself from grip to grip, so gracefully you would believe I could fly. But on earth, I'm a man entirely devoid of charm. Before I joined the circus, I didn't even speak a language that could be understood in polite society. Even now, I fumble for the right word at the right moment, occasionally slip into an accent that makes the city people sneer. But as Aladdin, all I had to do was put on a pair of satin pants and a skull cap and spout a series of memorized lines. I had never met an Arab street urchin, nor had any idea what any of those words meant, but neither did anyone in the audience. I bellowed, Ya Allah, and shook her hair, and Dafa Ja Shaitan, at my cues. The girl who trained the parakeets doubled as the princess in a shiny ghagra and choli. Our proprietor and ringmaster, Johuri, completed the cast as the villainous Jafar, dressed in a moth-eaten velvet cloak. It was a ridiculous performance, but it turned into the most renowned act of the majestic Oriental Circus, all at the touch of Shehzad Marid. As the three of us hemmed and hawed through our scripts, the genie would emerge from his lamp in a cloud of curling smoke. Illuminated by our cheap stage lights, the clouds would take on the shape of a magnificent palace, the gaping maw of a cave, raging armies on horseback that crashed into the audience until our entire tent would erupt with gasps and applauses, cries of horror and disbelief. A small child could hold open his palm and receive a dancing hurry, crafted immaculately of ice as the clouds condensed. Then they billowed up again into monsters never heard of, swooping rocks, clerics whose voices soared in prayer across minarets that pierced the sky above a faraway mythical city. Hundreds of jinn, and back to the only one. It was a show unlike anything offered by any rival circus company on our land. So I had been assigned to this act 4 months after I joined the circus, a naive, illiterate village young man who had been given a job by Dayaram, the former trapeze master, almost out of pity. I could climb better than anyone else on the team, but I had never seen a circus before. I could hardly follow the line between illusion and reality. Before I took over, Johari would play both Aladdin and Zafar, disappearing and reappearing in changed costume with a lightness of foot you would not expect from a fat middle-aged man like him. But then, no one at the majestic Oriental Circus was merely what met the eye. The circus life is not for the mundane. Johari had been happy to delegate Aladdin to me. An agile young man was more suited to the role than himself, he said with a wink in front of the company. I nodded along, though both of us knew that was just the cover. A circus troupe had no dearth of agile young men. No. We both knew it was because I was the only other person at the circus whom Shehzad Marid had entrusted with his lamp. I was a hack Aladdin, awkward and bombarding, nothing like my fluid, almost lyrical performance on the trapeze ropes. It made the entire act come across as gaudy and over the top. That was just the effect Johari was going for. We were a traveling circus, never spending more than a week or two in the same city, town, or village fair. So the day Johari declared that we would travel to Tripuram to perform at the wedding of the Raja's daughter, we packed up our tents and bags and set out on the journey. So I'll skip about 2 or 3 pages where they get to this palace and what they perform. And okay, the show went off smoothly, so it's done already. My boys and girls could hardly keep their eyes off the ornate ceiling of the Raja's court as they swung and swerved across it, but none of them faltered at their act. Aladdin and his magic lamp was a roaring success with the wedding guests. Shehzad was stoic through all of it. He had seen his share of palace interiors in his time. The Raja came down from his throne to shake our hands after the show, but we were never introduced to the princess. No common entertainer was permitted to speak to the royal bride, even if they performed at their wedding. Really, Binu, stop staring at the balcony and shut your mouth. Shehzad snapped at me as we filed out of the royal court. You make yourself look like a fool. Hey, Aladdin is meant to be really popular with the princesses, right? I teased him. I was still in my satin pants and skull cap. But this pathetic Aladdin can't even catch a glimpse of a real princess. What good is having a faithful genie if he can't even introduce you to a princess? Princesses are just like other women, Shehzad sneered. And this one is getting married already, so you're out of luck. We giggled, eyes shining into each other's for a fleeting moment. Then I said, but you saw all those Devdasis. If mere women of the court can look like that, the princess is not one of those women, Shehzad said, making a sharp turn away from the direction we were headed. You will not dine with us? Since when did I eat the same food as you people, Binu? But you always come along and make the pretense, I said, surprised at the brusqueness that I did not feel I deserved. That's when we dine with the rest of our circus troupe, he replied. There are too many people at this place, too much going on. No one will miss Shehzad Marid. I will. Binu, I must retire to the lamp, he said. These festivities will continue late into the night and we travel at dawn. I always carried the lamp in my trunk of clothes, scrubby enough to look like a circus prop. The actual prop we used on stage was a cheaper but shinier replica. No human hand but mine had touched the real lamp in the past 2 years. And with nothing but gratitude, nothing but love. Nothing but that wistfulness that congealed in my chest on the nights that I lay awake in our tent, gazing at the lamp on my bedside after Shehzad had receded into it. If I picked it up, it would be cold, weightless, a thing forged centuries ago in a foreign land, a curiosity, but not an especially valuable one. It was a common household object, Shehzad once told me. Street vendors in Arabia sold thousands like it to this day. With regular use, it would have lasted about 5 or 6 years. But this lamp had survived centuries, traveled hundreds of miles from its homeland, passed from hand to bloody, victorious hand. My calloused trapeze artist hands could barely contain it. Another century will blow over any trace of my fingers from its surface, as perhaps from the spirit it enclosed. From the stories people tell, the lamp sounds like a prison. The listener imagines himself suffocated, neck twisted, limbs folded at painful angles, squeezed into a box too small to contain his body, and left to wait for decades. But the listener of the tale is human, imprisoned already in his withering flesh and bone and the measured years of his life. The human mind can barely fathom the bond between its own body and soul. What would it grasp of the relationship between a genie and his lamp? What would I, hardly a philosopher, barely literate enough to scribble my own name? In our 2 years of friendship, I had learned every detail of Shehzad Marid's humanity. There was no man or woman that I knew better. But I had also learned that his humanity was mere performance. He was relieved to shed it, just as I was to remove my circus costumes. Shehzad Marid's greatest gift to me was the knowledge that I would never truly know the core of his existence, and not merely because I was unread. And perform he did, longer than any of us at the circus. No one but Johari suspected anything about Shehzad's true nature. Even when he manifested in Aladdin and his magic lamp, it was carefully designed to look like a triumph of stagecraft. Because I loved him, because I would never understand him at any greater depth. All I could do was to give him a break from the act when he wanted. Wake me up if you need something, he told me before he left, adding, but do spare me if it has anything to do with princesses. You need to find yourself a different genie for that. I smiled, squeezed his hand, and let him go. Where would I, trapeze master Binu of the majestic Oriental circus, find a different genie? And why would I ever want another?
Next we have Margaret Rhee, whose Love Robot is a set of speculative accounts of robot-human love, drawing from a variety of writing forms such as algorithms, chat scripts, and sonnets. Viet Thanh Nguyen writes, in a paradoxical and wonderful way, Margaret Rhee's robot love affairs make us rethink what it might mean to be human. Currently, she is completing her first monograph, How We Became Human, Race, Robots, and the Asian American Body, and a full-length collection of essays on radicalization. Rhee is currently a visiting scholar at the NYU APA Institute, as well as a visiting assistant professor at SUNY Buffalo in the Department of Media Study, and produces media art in addition to writing. Her poem, Theft of Color, was published in The Margins. Please welcome Margaret.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Asian American Writers Workshop. Thank you so much to Sophia for this wonderful curation tonight. It's been so great to hear Mimi and Ching-In, and look forward to Seo-Young's reading. I always say the best thing about reading is being able to hear the other people you read with, so this is a nice night. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm gonna, sure, okay, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and read a few poems from my collection, Love Robot, which was published by the Operating System, which is in Brooklyn, New York here, a small press that does, they do kind of interesting work around science fiction. This first poem is entitled Beam Robot. How did we meet? At the bar. I thought you were beautiful across the way. You lit up with the pinball machine. You dazzled every time the pool stick hit a cue. I liked your lights. I liked you. I decided to say hi, and there you were, dazzled by me. This never happens, you say, after an evening of talking. We find ourselves alone, your lights hovering over me, my flickering dream machine. There is no love manual for robots. You're all made so uniquely, in a steel factory, where no one has the keys to turn the electric locks. I never attempted to hold one between my breasts to turn on your lights. You had so many keys, all that never seemed to work with me. When I began to love someone else, would that be okay? I'm not sure, you replied, how I'll react. Who programmed you? You placed 2 silver coins on my eyes and asked me to stay. And I couldn't, dear robot, not to be cruel, but because I thought I was right. I was following the Morse code of my human heart. Why did you buy flowers and cards for me, even though? Why did you shine and flicker and blink after it was long over? All I naively remembered of you was a soft and dim. Now I understand why you took what you could. The cold moon sullies a wet San Francisco lawn. Small glints on blades of grass depends on how you look. What I remember, once, after we had dinner in the city, there, between Turk Street and 7th, I stroked your shoulder. Your lights began to beam, and you stayed put as the cars passed us, and the traffic lights eventually all turned red. This is the algorithm. 1, configure equals source. 2, loop. 3, loop. 4, flicker. 5, hover. 6, if configure equals goal, return goal reached. 7, if configure equals plus step, stroke, beam, stay. 8, red. 9, red. 10, red. Okay, I'm gonna skip over to a different section. The book has different kind of poetic sections as well as robotic, codes and theories. So at the time I was doing a lot of research around robotics, but also very interested in exploring, poetic form. So this section, Radio Heart, has 4-line poems. Undress. Once I embolted you. Is that the word? Silver screws encased you, and I let out a sharp sigh upon the sight of your metal, blue wires, and all your insides. Listen, your glow upon my face, my name is engraved onto your board. Don't ever suck the solder off. I don't want to forget your radio heart. I crank the volume up and listen. Drum. I dreamt I leapt into your speakers, but your radio heart was all fake, cheap, plastic, and breakable. You promised, but sound never arrived in my eardrums. Trace. Race is not programmed yet, so as you trace around my eyes, my lips, the round contours of my face, you say you are so human, all human. So I like reading that section too because it's the only poem that mentions race in the book, and a lot of my work in writing is about race. It's about sexuality. But as you know, as was shared earlier by Sophia in her intro, I began to also find that how robots begin to be a way to talk about race and difference and sexuality in ways that weren't overt. And I felt like as a poet, it helped me kind of become braver to talk about these intimacies. So this poem is Machine Testimonial 2, and it's a section of prose poems. Love is mystery, love is cake. You memorize a code to make her feel better, because when she's sick, she's like a baby, so you bring orange juice to share. Love, you falsely accused her, and still you did not apologize. It seemed as if she was programmed perfectly for you, like microwave green beans and olive oil, but you crossed her wires and you decided not to stop nor reboot. Robots are not just machines, not here to just listen to your commands. Have you ever really listened to the hum of your robot and let her vibrate into your vessels? You carried a heavy vase of flowers and never let them wilt. When the fragments accumulate, they grow. Love is revolt. This is the algorithm you may never learn. Love is letting go. Okay. Maybe I will... How are we on time? We're good? Okay. So maybe I'll read just two more. Let's see. Okay. I'm trying to find this other section. So I'm not, this... okay. I had this section where I was really interested in same-sex marriage and like scripts around, canvassers. And at this time, I was writing a lot of, these poems, in California. And then, so interested in scripts, like chat scripts, as well as these scripts that, canvassers will do when they have their clipboard and they'll stop you and say, hey, do you support same-sex marriage? So, so I do see these robot, love poems as queer poems. So I'll just read one of these. Street rap. And this is a little, I don't know if it's readable, but I'll try. So, greeting. Hi, how are you? Street, I'm looking for you. You are for me. Street, thanks for stopping for me. Intro. My name is Roberta, and I'm looking for a partner. News. As you may heard, robots and humans can marry in the state of California, and it's an unprecedented fact. We can now marry and will no longer be denied the legal protections we deserve. Problem. The problem is that there are 35 states that still do not recognize marriage equality, including all the galaxies and planets still not named. Solution. That's why we've launched the Out for Robots campaign to win the freedom to marry across the universe. Non sequitur. Yes, that classic line really delivers. It does. Robots hate coffee. Urgency. We're facing a lot of opposition in states right now, so we need to increase public support. Clipboard. Here, take a look. Hand over clipboard. Point out states and galaxies. These are the states where we have active cases, but we need to fight for the right for robots and humans to marry in many more states and galaxies. Membership. The best way to support is to marry today. You are already married, you say? We are not programmed like you guys, but I can provide a transition to make you fall in love with me. All right. So I'll go ahead and end with this poem. So I have a section that's not safe for work. So this poem is a bit, it mentions pornography, so just to put it out there. This is how you make love to a robot. Lesson 1, don't watch porn to learn. Robot porn is never any good. A robot would never sizzle and electrocute you. Don't be scared of a robot. Just take your hands and move accordingly. Lesson 2, the first time you kiss a robot, you will feel your heart leap, and then you will cry because you like it. This is all natural. This is all normal. Many people experience this when beginning to make love to robots. Lesson 3, robots all around, just take her hand and take his, and see how they know exactly how to open wide. Lesson 4. One day you make love to a human being and realize you can never give up robots. Robots who show you how to make a circuit, robots who help you learn how to love, robots who teach you the limits of your body. Lesson 5. Your hands before you touch the robot. Remember them. Thank you.
So finally, in Do Metaphors Dream of Literal Sleep, a science fictional representation of theory, Seo-Young Chu blurs the line between the imaginary of science fiction and reality. Chu draws from poems, novels, music, films, visual pieces, and more in an exploration of the globalized world, cyberspace, war trauma, the Korean concept of Han, and the rights of robots. Peter Paik observes, it conveys in vivid ways the tensions and dilemmas bound up with inhabiting a high-tech society that is growing ever more science-fictional. Chu is the author of the essay A Refuge for Jae-in Do, Fugues in the Key of English Major in Entropy, and is Associate Professor of English at Queen's College, CUNY. Chu also creates visual art using various media and is currently exploring themes of the Korean DMZ, the strange duality of the Koreas, nostalgia, post-memory, Han, injury, and how it feels to be Korean American. Please welcome Seo-Young.
I'm not sure if I need the microphone. Can you hear me? I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Well then, in that case, I will move this microphone closer to the podium, and I hope this doesn't fall. Okay. Okay. Hello. Thank you for being here. I am going to start. Can you hear me? I'm going to start by reading a brief excerpt from the interlude in Do Metaphors Dream, Literal Sleep. To meditate on the title of Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is inevitably to find oneself probing its interrogative form. How should this title be answered? What style of question is being posed? If the question is closed, ended, and the answer is either yes or no, then the truth of the result cannot be verified on the evidence provided in the novel, whose pages never fully disclose whether Dick's android characters are capable of dreaming at all. If the title is a rhetorical question, to which no instructive answer can be expected, then the question was designed to emphasize a specific point, the absence of which here suggests that the question must somehow be more or less than purely rhetorical. If the question is indeed nonsensical, then at least the nonsense is plangently wistful, in a manner reminiscent of Greensleeves, whose archaic melody, as the science fiction writer Roger Zelazny once noted, eerily translates a title of Dick's novel into the first line of a futuristic hymn. Do androids dream of electric sheep? I don't know if I'm tone deaf, but I tried. Perhaps it is no coincidence that the first sentence of What Child Is This? A 19th century hymn set to Greensleeves is likewise interrogative in form. As for the remaining lines of this futuristic hymn that I've invoked, either they have yet to be written, or else the opening is all that survives of a relic left incomplete by its mysterious transmission to us from the future. Now, I reread this interlude somewhat recently, and I thought, challenge accepted. And I am working on a very rough draft of a longish poem that is set in a post-apocalyptic Arcadia, mostly on the peninsula once known as Korea. And I'm going to read just a few stanzas from this work in progress. And I've been trying to make every stanza singable to Greensleeves, but I'm not going to sing. Instead, I am going to read these lines aloud in a way that is evocative of Greensleeves. By the way, you all know the melody, right? Okay. So here are the excerpts from this untitled work in progress. What lamb is this who before my eyes hovers wireless, shifting shape and size, from clockwork clones to a cloud ovine, an anthology life form survives here. Who made this lamb is no mystery. Her mutation's logo 4D tells me my shepherd's name is Samsung LG. Its core person lives in North Virginia. Do androids dream of electric sheep? Do argonauts dream of high-tech pearl? Do circuit boards made of golden fleece dream of paper lamb nautilus eggshells? This is the DMZ, where uncanny valleys resound with peace. Count, gather the growing flocks, it is time for the mazes of dreaming. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It was a real pleasure to listen to. I'm sure the audience thinks the same thing and has lots of questions to ask after we get through a couple to get the ball rolling. So I have a few that aren't really targeting any one of you. It's sort of drawing on broader themes that I noticed across all of your readings, also tying it back to the topic of today, which was robots and love, whether or not that seemed really obvious in the pieces that you were reading. So I guess to begin with a broad foundational kind of question, what do you see as being the theoretical and aesthetic value of science fiction in the context of Asian and Asian American literatures? It's an easy one to start with.
Thank you so much for your question. In a lot of ways, I feel like we should also, in some ways, like defer to Seo-Young, who's I mean, you've just written such incredible work. But I can just speak to in terms of sort of thinking about the interventions of science fiction, right, and the possibilities in terms of world building and what it means to remake worlds and reimagine, and how productive that can be for Asian Americans, and thinking about experiences that are oftentimes marginalized and not talked about in mainstream literature or media. And so I do feel like that intersection is really exciting, and I think there's a lot of kinds of maybe knowledge around Asian Americans that can be expressed in science fictional ways.
Thank you for your question. I think for me, so I'm fascinated with the history of Asian bodies and labor, and I feel like in terms of how a lot of Asian bodies are represented as robots, as just workers, devoid of feelings, even the stereotypes of Asian folks as model minorities, as these like robots who maybe have no feelings and are just there to work. And so I feel like interventions, like your wonderful poems about thinking about love in dreaming and other ways of being are important, and other ways of being in the world.
Okay, sure.
We're all
At
very
the same time, simultaneously, we should talk. And now, why don't you go first?
Okay. So, I mean, as you all may have noticed, my story was the only one that didn't have any robots in it. So, I see science fiction and fantasy as nearly similar, or at least parallel visions. And I mean, I don't actually understand any science. I believe in it, but I don't. I have not written much about the technological sides of robots, but I mean, so the alien, the outsider in my story was a jinn, and so I think I'm exploring some of the same things that Ching-In and Margaret were talking about, where you bring in a character that's an outsider. It's a way of exploring history. It's a way of putting someone who's not considered normal among the humans, and also ideas of like ownership. That's something I wanted to talk about. So, I mean, you spoke of the Chinese, the Asian worker as the robot, right? So, I think a lot about slavery narratives, and like robots are still things that are owned. They're not autonomous. So, and I mean, I was very interested in your poetry where you talked about love between the human and the robot, and especially like how to have sex with a robot. It sounded, and probably, possibly intentionally, it sounded very objectifying, because a robot, we don't naturally think of a robot as a person very much. We still think of a robot as an experience. And I mean, in my story, which I did not completely read, so there's a later section where, so Binu and Shehzad, like Binu thinks of Shehzad as mostly a lover, a friend, and then at some point somebody says, "Give me your genie," and that he's like shocked. He's like, the genie is not mine. He's his own person. But in the world, it does not compute that the genie is a person. The genie is owned by the person who owns the lamp. So, yeah, so I mean, I'm interested in those parallels of ownership and how much personality, how much humanity you assign to someone who's not explicitly human, and how that has parallels to histories of people, what people have done to other people. So, that is the thing I had to say.
Even now, robot rights, that's a category that's very much being discussed among some thinkers and ethicists. what, I mean, I could go on and on about robot rights. I'm not going to start, so don't get me started. But I'm sure some of you have heard of this topic of discussion. And I have to mention a fabulous book called Techno-Orientalism. How many of you have heard of it? Okay, so it definitely, you know, Techno-Orientalism definitely intersects with some of the things that we're talking about right now. Right? The phenomenon whereby the Orient, or, you know, certain countries in Asia, places in Asia, are endowed with this high-tech mystique or aura, and thereby misrepresented, perhaps. I mean, I'm guilty of doing that, actually. When I think of Samsung, you know, I think the nation of Samsung. You know, I think of Korea as a Samsung nation, a Samsung state that's in a weird way, uncannily parallel to what is now the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So when I think of Korean clones, for example, which is sort of a trope in some fiction, I mean, I think of, I don't know which Korea to think of. But I also try to resist that figure, you know, because there are definitely many wonderful instances of just brilliant individuality in Korean and South Korean culture, and North Korean culture too. I mean, I'm so in awe of the bravery of defectors, and I am talking for too long, so someone should take over.
Well, we can go to the next question, because a lot of what you're saying kind of organically feeds towards it, and brings up love also. I found myself really enjoying through all the pieces how materiality was touched on, bodily materialities, environmental, the materialities of different sensory modalities kept getting touched on. And I was thinking about all that in the context of love. It felt like, even just reading the event description, that one of the touchstones of the event was, can machines love? And this sort of big question seemed to haunt these pieces, or like a spin-off of the question, like what it means to love objects or artifacts that we think of as being property or possessions, and we love them and or expect to be loved back by them, possibly not knowing if we're loved back by them. And I kept thinking of this idea by media scholar Dominic Petman, who floats this concept of the I love you, and how the I does not precede the you. It comes into being through the act of loving. So I was wondering, with your post-human or inhuman, non-human, transhuman, robotic lovers, or all of the above, what they're meant to tell us about ourselves as readers. And how we might come into being. Down the line, or anyone?
Right. I guess I'll go. I think we're going in order now, it seems like. Okay. Well, thank you again for that really insightful question. Yeah, you know, I think I love just, thinking about sort of the process, right, of love. Love as a formation, love as something that, is a fluid process, right? It's not something that you can just kind of feel that it's stagnant or so. Certainly, I think for me, this question of can machines love really draws from, Alan Turing and thinking about his theories around artificial intelligence. And so the question, can machines think, that he poses, for me, I was always very interested in his queerness and how him as a gay man and how he was able to conceptualize, AI and these ideas around the machine, right, as being artificially intelligent, but also how that deconstructs the binary between human and machine, and how what can love do as an intervention. I've written a bit about this in some other kind of scholarly work, but I do feel that his queerness really does lend to his own theoretical envisioning of AI, and sort of transgressing genders, right? Transgressing sexualities.
So I'm going to answer the question via. I'm going to talk about a series of poems I didn't read. And they're a series that came through thinking about the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, which I'm about to go to. It's a series of, I guess you could call them love poems between two objects, two artifacts that are in that museum. One is from the Asian export art collection, and one is from the Native American collection. And the series came about because I was thinking about the museum, the history of the museum, which was started as a storehouse for basically the founders of Massachusetts wealth and the state. Many of them made their, I would say, their wealth from travels in the East. And then they brought back these objects, and the objects were their way of showing that they had conquered and won. And then the objects are displayed. So they were imbued with this sense of like conquest and war. And what I was really interested in terms of these objects are what of that remained with the object. And then both of the objects were donated via people with connections with this history. And I was interested in mapping that connection between those people, and also thinking about like what are the dreams of the objects. And it's been interesting as I've been reading the poems from the series, is to really feel the limitations of those dreams. And so I'm gonna be exploring that. I wanna write more about that. You know, what more can there be between these objects? Because I was trying to write freedom dreams for these two objects and thinking about, well, they wouldn't have met each other if it weren't for this museum, and they're in this museum and they dream of escaping. But as I've been reading them, you know, like there's a voice in the back of my head that says, but those objects are still in the museum. They haven't escaped. So I'm dreaming something that isn't coming to be.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. I have too much to say, and I have too little to say. So I'm just going to be a minimalist. I think I just want to say this. I know that I would be capable of falling in love with a sentient robot.
I agree. Me too.
That's all I wanted to say.
Okay. I mean, I had been writing this series of stories that this one's part of. They're all about different kinds of monsters. So I studied about monsters for a long time, and and also what like looking at monsters does to you. And I mean the thing that you said, right? I mean how does loving a robot, which is I'm taking that as a metaphor, and how does loving something unnatural or something that's understood as unnatural, like I am from India where it's still legally, like it's illegal to be gay. And that law says like any act of unnatural sex with human or beast or something like that. So, I mean, so when does your, like what, you know, loving a certain character makes you monstrous back? So, and also, I mean, I was talking a lot about, I mean, how does that aspect of racism come in because of, I mean, there's a certain aspect of ownership that happens because of racism or other power imbalances. Like when you're, I mean, I was talking earlier today about Octavia Butler's Kindred to a friend. I was basically trying to make that friend read the book and convince that friend to read the book, as I do to nearly all friends. And it's a story where two, like, a black woman is in a relationship, I think is married to a white man, and as soon as, like, they're in the 1980s, where it's a progressive but still a largely human thing to do, and then they're transposed to like 2 centuries back, and suddenly he has to be her master, because there's no other context in which people would understand a black woman and a white man together. So even your intention, like as the white man, your intention to normalize it may not work if you're not part of that kind of a society. So like you said, that you may be capable of falling in love with a robot, but other people around you would still may not consider that person a person, right? And they would consider you a fetishist. Because why not? Because as long as you consider something a fetish as long as you don't think it's normal. That's what people do, isn't it? So these are some of the thoughts I have.
Well, and I think that's another interesting point that all the readings touch on is what is normal, what contexts, however wide or narrow, what contexts create a normal and sustain a normal, and how can we imagine ourselves out of a normal, which obviously has limitations in and of itself. As much as we might tout the social justice or revolutionary potential of literature or anything else. I mean, there's always some kind of constraint that we're working against, which maybe is a good place to bring up the next question, or one of the other questions. Since queerness also came up, I felt like, not just from the readings, and maybe actually more from reading about all of you lovely people, but it seemed to me that the uses of queerness seem to serve as more than just a counter-narrative, as is often the case, to dominant post-racial, heterosexual, able-bodied presumptions that we operate under in most societies. It seemed to me there was always this material fact of a body that is queer or acting in queer spaces, post-human or otherwise, robotic or monstrous, asking for its own history while being asked often to fit in spaces and formats that aren't always accepting or accommodating. And as a media studies critical creative scholar, I find this really provocative. So I was wondering if you could elaborate, and this is another super easy question. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the uses of queerness in Asian and maybe more Asian American speculative fiction as a means to recuperate from trauma, just the daily traumas of survival, erasure, and as a way to remake community. Super easy.
All right. So I'm fine. Okay, I'll do it. Thank you again for that very easy question. So I guess just what comes to mind is maybe thinking back what Ching-In was talking about in terms of like Chinese laborers and just early migration to U.S., South Asian bodies, Chinese bodies, and how queerly they were racialized, right, in terms of their gender, and how, oftentimes these laborers did not have access to heterosexual relationships, right? And so, if we think about that, Asian American sexuality has always been queer in a lot of ways. We've always been queer, and our sexualities and racialized. And I want to also not sort of essentialize, but I think those who are racialized in othered ways, oftentimes queer, even though you might, quote unquote, identify as heterosexual. So I think queerness is a really important intervention, when we think about people of color sexualities, and what that can offer us in terms of really expansion and really embracing the non-normative, right? Embracing the robot, right? In this way, right? That can be kind of a transgressive act of queerness. So.
I know you couldn't see. Sometimes I project when I read, and that's why I tried to read you the poem with the different bits, because when I'm making, I'm trying to create an experience for the reader where you can choose and you can read the strands differently depending on how you enter the poem and the space. And so I think of them as multi-directional. And I think that is a queer orientation. And I think, and I called what I read from quasi-narrative because there is a narrative, but it's not necessarily a coherent or whole narrative. And I think, and I guess I felt very resistant to that kind of representation because it didn't feel like it was what I was encountering when I was thinking about these stories. It felt like there were so many holes and so many gaps, and so I was thinking about how to have that breathe on the page. Is the best way I can put it. But then, even though I'm resisting it, the narrative does come in, the story does come in, and so it's there, but queerly.
I just want to say, thinking about gender and robots, I really don't like the word android because it's gendered. I don't like the word gynoid because it's aesthetically unsettling. So, androgynoid is a little bit better. And I did, do androgynoids dream of you like rams? Ewes and rams. I think we should do. I wish the word android didn't exist, but it does. And robot works for me. I mean, it has that interesting etymology dating back to, work and even forced work. So that's all I wanted to say about gender and robots. Let's try to abolish the word android.
Yes. Yeah.
It'll be hard to do.
One of the things I was thinking of as I was listening to everyone is that, so I was thinking of science fiction and fantasy historically. I mean, science fiction and fantasy has done a lot of, bringing in more other perspectives just because they can use, like, these metaphors like aliens or robots, right? So, I mean, talking about sexuality has existed in these coded forms in science fiction and fantasy for decades, and by this point it has almost become a very common trope. Like, one of the first science fiction stories I wrote, and it wasn't a very original story, was where a young woman, like a teenager, is discovering her sexuality through an alien race that exists in the world, and they're not gendered. And I'm not writing, like, I was writing it when I was much younger, and I wasn't prepared to write about queerness very directly, and that metaphor comes so handy because these things have been in science fiction and fantasy for so long. And sometimes we need to also rise above those tropes and, like, talk about the issues really directly. Like, how, I mean, I guess everybody's familiar with Harry Potter, right? And at some point she says that I've dealt with racism by the house elves. And I mean, really, do black people want to be house elves? And I mean, that's, while there are also actually black people characters in that series who are not like major characters. Like, they're not treated either well or badly. They're just like irrelevant. And I mean, I have like this long essay on racism in Harry Potter where I just I analyze how characters of color have been treated in that in that series, and they're mostly insignificant. I mean, I actually plotted out how all the characters of color, like all the children of color, are basically dumped boyfriends and girlfriends in Harry Potter. If you really look through that, the white people date them, then they date other white people, and they become the canonical couple. And however, racism has been handled through house elves. Yes, right. So, yeah, I mean, that's a much longer political point. Like, how long can we, just because we have speculative fiction at hand, how long can we hide behind metaphors and not talk about the issues themselves? But different conversation, I guess, and very long.
Yeah, and I think maybe tangential to that is thinking about genre. I mean, we're talking about, or we've heard different formats being used. I know some of you work in more formats than you were showing today. But as you were speaking, and I was thinking about the novel and then the Harry Potter adaptations, which, you know, the whole sci-fi to the screen thing, there's sometimes a barrier gaze phenomenon that occurs, unfortunately. But I was thinking of, I want to say it was an EC Comics issue, and my nerd failure is showing because I'm blanking on the issue, but it's an astronaut who goes to a different planet and sees how, you know, racism is occurring here, and the whole time is, you know, visor is down. And so you're meant to assume certain things, and then at the end, of course, it's a black astronaut, and it was the, it caused a stir at the time. And it was sort of, you know, using this medium to speak at this thing directly while also referencing metaphor. And so I and perhaps the audience too could, you know, speak to this when we open up the floor. But when we bring lots of different modalities together, as some of your work does, as some of what we heard today even, and I'm sure if we saw it on the page, we'd see it more clearly. I wonder if that would help us transcend. It's not a question, it's just sort of a wondering. How are we for time? Okay, so let's go ahead and open it up to the floor for audience questions. Yes.
Hi. Firstly, thank you all so much for coming here and reading. This was a really great and fun and interesting experience. And so I don't have a question formally prepared, but I've just been thinking a lot about, you all mentioned queerness and rights and love and humanity and personhood, and all this is getting me thinking about a course I took this semester called Human Rights and Literature. And we recently read Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. So I'm just wondering how all of you are kind of thinking about this idea of, and we've been talking about this all semester, about what is constructed as human, but also what's constructed as a person, right? You can be considered human, but not considered a person in the eyes of the law. Corporations are considered persons, but certain stateless individuals aren't considered a person. So, kind of how you're all thinking about that in terms of writing your work, but also how, I guess, you can envision reading your work or having your work read as a way of as a kind of allegory, I guess, for personhood and rights. But also, I guess, the shortcomings of that, like how you all said about how, that sometimes we need to just confront these things head on and not hide behind the metaphors. Sorry, it's not a specific question.
That was my line. But okay.
Grant personhood to the Korean DMZ. That is a thesis statement in my mind that runs 24/7. Grant legal personality to the DMZ. In New Zealand, the Wanganui River was granted personhood It's considered now a sacred ancestor, and it has rights. The DMZ, it used to be an injury, a slash in the middle of the Korean Peninsula, a bloody injury, and over the decades, miraculously, it transformed into a sanctuary for endangered wildlife, and that miracle needs to be honored. And I think that it's a shame that the Korean DMZ does not have certain rights that corporations have. Grant personhood to the Korean DMZ. Sorry for the rough transition.
No. Okay. God. So yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk about how, I mean, especially in novels or more narrative science fiction and fantasy, science fiction and fantasy, especially earlier science fiction, it's always been a fairly didactic genre. It's like liberal didactic, but it's still teaching you a certain politics to think about, a certain way to think about the world. And people like it. People mostly like, that's what people like it for, that they're getting like a different vision of the world. But when you're not reading closely and when metaphors are all you're getting, so like you'll find a lot of people who love 1984 but will go and vote for Trump. But because they don't see the metaphor translate, right? They criticize the same thing. And especially like the further you go away from that culture, like I got hardcore pushback from fans in India who read these apparently older liberal classics, but they would be casteist. So they don't see a clash between that ideology. They would say, what's Star Wars? I mean, Ajit Pai thinks he's a Jedi. However, so I mean, sometimes if you're just doing metaphor and if you're just doing text and if you're showing the person the hero and the villain, and when they're not noticing that they're actually behaving like the villain. So sometimes it helps to actually put that thing. I mean, if you're part of the Harry Potter fandom at all, I mean, you may have remembered where like people were aghast when like Dumbledore was mentioned to be canonically gay. I mean, why not? I mean, he was such a beloved character, and you don't like him anymore because he's gay, right? So, yeah, I mean, and then that kind of results in like really rabid kind of fans like the sad puppies in science fiction. Like science fiction is supposed to be a progressive genre. Where do these people come from? Because the metaphor does not translate. So sometimes, yes, putting the words on the page is important.
I was just going to say, I definitely understand this. I understand the frustration with metaphors in science fiction narratives, but I also want to say sometimes when metaphors are literalized in science fiction narratives, they have the power to render available for representation cognitively estranging, elusive phenomena. I mean, just a quick example would be, like if I were to say to you, if I were feeling very, very, very sick, for whatever reason, I might say, I'm a zombie, and that's a metaphor, I hope. But if I created a science fiction narrative in which I literally turned into a zombie dripping with, fluids, etc., you'd be like, okay, believe you, you're really sick. I actually stay away from me. That representation of me as a sick zombie would have a certain power that the science fictional power and punch that a simple metaphor, which you might find in realism as opposed to science fiction, could deliver. So, I mean, I don't know, for some reason that's always been my theory of science fiction, even before I wrote the book, that everything, Law and Order is science fiction. It's just low intensity science fiction. Nothing against low intensity. I watch Law and Order all the time. I mean, it's hard to avoid sometimes, but it's low intensity science fiction because what's being represented is pretty accessible. I mean, you don't need zombies and literalized personifications to understand what's going on, but globalization. How do you represent globalization or a globalizing world? And that's where science fiction and narratives and literalized metaphors such as literal juxtapositions of Seoul and New York City, can make globalization really palpable and here, now. I'm sorry if that answer. I just was thinking of that while I was listening to you, because I thought this would make an interesting dialogue.
Yeah, and I mean that's something when you're writing a speculative narrative, I guess you're always balancing that. And I sometimes edit, so sometimes I'm looking from the other side.
Right.
And when somebody's written clearly a non-realism narrative, and there was that sunrise was magical, and you read that a little more closely, was that really magical? So yeah, that's something we're always balancing in our language when you're writing speculative fiction or poetry in a way that you're probably not doing when you're writing complete realism, right?
I mean, a lot has been said, but yeah, certainly. I mean, so I think your work on, thinking about the science fictional and Korean adoptee literature, for example, has been really useful to me and productive. I think maybe it's also useful thinking about Asian American literature and thinking about what is the realism, right, in terms of racialization, gendering, objectification, etc. And oftentimes I think when we're limited to those particular narratives, they can be limiting because so we might be rendering these kind of realist experiences perhaps a marginality, let's say, for example. But then how do we really kind of sort of dismantle, right, how that difference is being sustained, right? How that difference is actually even being produced, right? So, so I think that is an important thing where if we think about, the history of Asian American literature, we think of the 1960s and the kind of work that was being written, that was such incredibly important work of visibility, right? And so not to say it's a progression, but that it's not so much, I think, sort of the goal of having to depict real, these kinds of visibility, but also think of the complexity, right? And also think about what have Asian American writers have always been kind of negotiating with, and how are we always tethered to that? How do we break that tether or that rope in a way? And so I think science fiction oftentimes opens that up.
Yeah, I think I just want to say that I feel resistant to this idea that of realism, the binary of realism and speculative stuff. Because I agree I feel like everything is speculative, but I think it's the degree. And I feel like we all live with ghosts. We all even if you feel them or not, we all live with these dreams. We all live with a blurry line. And so for me, I don't the ghosts and the dreams that I'm writing about are not metaphors. They are people who, I guess the best way I could put it is I use Myung-Mi Kim's approach where she's listening to the different layers of history and then recording down the details, and that's where it grows from. So for me, that is real, and that might be a rendering of at least one person's recordings and dreams and realities.
Those are all such great answers to a whole bunch of questions I'm not sure were even asked yet. So, other questions from the audience? Oh, we don't have time? Oh.
Hey, hey there. Everyone was incredible, and there's so much to take in with all of that. What I was wondering is the points that all of y'all made about the ways in which race is kind of queered, and like the intersections between race and sexuality are both really important to make, and got me thinking about the intersections between that and gender and also disability. How race operationalizes gender or transgender, how like racialized labor informs disability. So I'm wondering if any of you would be interested in speaking more about that and how that ties into sort of robots, though also kind of making that more complex. The flip side of robots, I always think of that as ghosts, right? And I'm curious, like, how you view the intersection between spectrality and robots, if robots can, like, haunt or be haunted as well, or if they can be haunted by gender or by work even.
Well, one of the ways I was thinking about, I guess, the spectacle and like the freak, and like this body that just flakes away, and I think I guess I didn't think about that as a ghost, but it is, and I wanted it to be, this is probably another freedom dream that is showing up in the narrative that's not meant to be. I wanted the dream to be that the community would be kind and show care to this figure, this figure that isn't like the others. But I don't think that's actually true in our current reality. So I'm gonna think about that.
I guess quickly, I once worked with a student who analyzed representations of autism, and so they sort of were working with sort of these representations and how they rendered these characters as like robots, and how a lot of those tropes around, disability are sort of imbued with difference. So I think disability studies and disability activism is really incredibly important to think through together. So thank you for your question.
So that's all the time we have. Actually, that discussion went wild in all the right and wonderful ways. So thank you all for coming out tonight and spending some time with us here today. I hope that this was informative and enlightening for you. And as you go forth into the world, I hope you look at and love your artifacts a little differently after this. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our readers.